Welcome to the Global Seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean for Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so honored that you've joined us today for this first global seminar in our Collaboratory series focused on pathways to decarbonization. Okay, welcome. I think we had a little technical glitch, but welcome to our first seminar series focused on pathways to decarbonization, which invites experts to step into the collaboratory to discuss critical issues and explore ways countries around the world are working on developing integrated long-term plans for decarbonization. And now, before we begin this important discussion, and especially for those of you joining us for the very first time today, I want to provide a bit of background about the Global Columbia Collaboratory. The Columbia University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, in partnership with the Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects, launched the Global Columbia Collaboratory in May of 2020 as a virtual exchange platform to support students around the world. The Collaboratory brings thought leaders and educators together, promotes cross-cultural communication, and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. Students have participated from over 39 countries around the world and are drawn from all 3 undergraduate schools at Columbia, as well as visiting institutions. Now this fall, we have 30 students participating from 12 locations around the world. They're representing 16 universities and tuning in this morning across Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas, including Brazil, China, Dominican Republic, France, Ghana, Greece, Morocco, Pakistan, Russia, Singapore, Spain, USA, and Zambia, just to name a few. Using smartphones and laptops to access the Collaboratory virtual exchange platform, students form a community of global thinkers and problem solvers through participation in themed global seminars featuring international speakers, such as our seminar today, as well as facilitated reflection, ideation, and collaboration activities. As learning and perspectives are shared across the Collaboratory, students form project teams and receive funding to collaborate to tackle specific global issues and topics of interest. And the Collaboratory serves as an incubator for bringing ideas into reality by promoting new projects and innovative solutions to global challenges. Now, we are thrilled that undergraduate students from all over the world have been actively engaged in the Collaboratory every semester since it launched in 2020. And the program continues this fall with this very important focus on energy systems and land use planning. Now, I encourage the global audience to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Again, I want to welcome everyone to this Global Columbia Collaboratory seminar. And I want to thank all of our partners and esteemed panelists. This semester, we're so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Center in Rio and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. And at this time, I want to introduce Lauren Marino, Chief of Staff for the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, who will give some introductory remarks and introduce our panelists today. Lauren?
Thank you so much, Shannon. We have a very wonderful and esteemed panel with us today. We're so grateful that all of them made themselves available for this exciting session. They will speak in the same order that I am about to introduce them in. Dr. Grace Wu is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies Department at UC Santa Barbara, where she uses spatial science approaches to identify and understand the co-benefits as well as trade-offs between climate solutions and habitat conservation. Then we'll have Dr. Emily Leslie, a principal at Montara Mountain Energy, which is a small energy consulting firm. She provides expertise in geospatial planning for renewable energy, as well as technical and policy support for clean energy planning for local, state, and federal governments. So she's working out a lot of different spatial scales as well. And then our third speaker will be Dr. Jamil Farbs, a principal at Evolved Energy Research. He specializes in deep, rigorous analysis of energy systems in a way that drives understanding of the most important dimensions of complex problems, which the energy transition is definitely one. So without further ado, Dr. Wu, the floor is yours for our first presentation.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Excited to be here today. Let me just start sharing my screen. How does that look?
Perfect.
Great.
We can see the top of the I think it's going to be fine. It's full screen. We just can see the website, the web.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yep,
yeah, this isn't a Google slide deck, and I don't want it to be full screen. Great. Hi, everyone. So as Laura mentioned, I am an assistant professor at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm in the environmental studies program. I was very formerly, not too long ago, a postdoc with the Nature Conservancy. So a lot of the work I'll be presenting today stems from a very long time collaboration with TNC North America. Just to provide an overview for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to be providing a motivation for why, and I hope frame some of the work that Emily and Jamil will be sharing for why spatial planning and land use is so critical for renewable energy build out and basically decarbonization and low carbon transitions writ large. I'll provide a case study and kind of deep dive example of a framework for how to integrate land use and spatial analysis into renewable energy planning. And I'll wrap up by providing a few high-level takeaways and some recommendations for how to best carry forward some of the findings that we from our previous studies. So just a quick note, when I talk about renewable energy, in this presentation, I have a specific focus on onshore wind, solar, and long-distance transmission. So as a way to start framing why land use planning is so critical and why we need spatial analysis, one way to think about this is taking a look at some of the most recent studies that have examined carbon neutral pathways. This is a figure from a recent study from the Evolved Energy team that was recently published, and they provide annual capacity builds for renewable energy over 5-year periods. I'm highlighting one of these that show particular build out for under a specific scenario. If we take those additions in gigawatts, we can see that the land use equivalents are potentially enormous. An entire state of New Mexico for wind, onshore wind, and 2 states, Vermont and New Hampshire, for just utility scale PV. So in the US, at least, land is very much spoken for. There is a lot of it, but this figure on the right shows how we use land in the US. So in order to integrate this much renewable energy, it needs to be displacing an existing land use or somehow integrated or compatible with an existing land use. And that itself is an enormous signing challenge. Studies have also shown that outside of renewable energy and including renewable energy, the term energy sprawl has been coined and evaluated to be one of the largest land use drivers in the US. And at the same time, social scientists have increasingly identified land use conflicts with energy siting, coining this term green civil war because it's been renewable community versus environmental and conservation community. And as a note, the figure on the right, on the left does not include many other energy type infrastructure or biomass that's required under a comprehensive low impact, low carbon transition. As I mentioned with the Green Civil War term, over the years, these are headlines from major news outlets over the last decade or so. The types of environmental conflicts that have arisen due to renewable energy infrastructure siting has increased. It really started out sort of a very localized, species-specific green versus green, and more recently has evolved into very large scale bans on renewable energy development. The largest county, San Bernardino County in the US, has basically banned large scale solar. And it's evolved into kind of a food versus solar, food versus wind type of battle, where essentially agricultural lands have been banned in certain counties from renewable energy development. So this is increasingly a problem, and we're still very much in the early phases of this transition. So there are very few studies that have actually examined the extent to which siting is a barrier to project failure. And the two studies that I'm showing here, one of which was just published this year, looked at 53 canceled or delayed projects and found that environmental concerns or land use conflicts are the largest sources of opposition for those canceled projects. And another study that was released a few years ago looked just at wind in the Midwest. So that's the figure on the top right, showed that when a wind farm is sited in a lower impact area, it's 50% less likely to be canceled. And when there's positive publicity around that wind farm, it's 25% less likely to be canceled. This underscores the importance of the location of that farm and the way that those renewable energy projects interact with its surrounding community. So I'm going to provide a deep dive. This is the second part of the talk into a study that we finished and is in the early phases of being released into the public. So it's going to be published as a peer-reviewed manuscript, and then executive summary, and multiple other outputs of the study will be released over the next couple of weeks. So I'll provide an overview of some of the major results, and importantly, describe the approach that we took that we anticipate will be highly generalizable and replicable in other contexts. So this study was done, funded by the Nature Conservancy. It was done in partnership with Montara Mountain Energy, Evolved Energy, and myself at UCSB. So what are the components of what I've been calling sort of a spatial planning framework for renewable energy planning? So my argument is that this planning framework should estimate land use requirements so that we have an understanding of that scale of land use and ocean use that's required. It should also be able to allow us to understand the land use impacts. So what types of land use, land cover types, ecosystems, habitats are going to be potentially impacted? And then what are the land use constraints? So if we place particular types of values on certain areas and we restricted those from siting, how does that impact our future renewable energy build out? Does that significantly increase costs? And so this framework should be able to comprehensively allow us to make decisions using a set of criteria that's based on land use as well as electricity system criteria. So this is the framework that I've been describing. I know it's a lot of text, but I really just want to focus on the center column that have the numbers. So this is kind of our 5-step process for how we've integrated land use considerations into an energy planning framework. So I'll step through these because it's an important component of the study, is creating this particular workflow. So in the top with the environmental exclusions data collections, this is where we've gathered spatial data that represent different types of land value. And in our case, working with the Nature Conservancy, These are environmental, ecological, mostly natural working lands areas that have some kind of conservation value. We use that into what we call a site suitability model. These tools allow us to identify areas that are suitable and potentially available for wind and solar development, as well as transmission siting. And we produce what we call a supply curve. This is the supply of renewable energy and transmission, aggregated at much higher, much larger areas, so entire states. And we put that into a capacity expansion model. I highlight that in orange here because this is kind of what most jurisdictions around the world, most certainly in California and the region that we're studying, they use this type of investment model that allows them to identify how much renewable energy they'll need by a certain time. So, and we supply that availability of renewable energy. The output of that are non-spatial. So everything that I've highlighted in light blue are spatially explicit inputs or outputs. And this capacity expansion modeling is coarse. As I said, it's typically aggregated at a state level or somewhat sub-state level, but it's very much non-spatial. So in the fourth step, we perform something we call downscaling, or in this case, site selection, where we basically identify the specific areas that could or most likely would meet that particular renewable energy target that's been identified through the capacity expansion modeling. And then finally, we take these spatially explicit outputs from step 4, and we perform some kind of impact assessment, whether that be an ecological or an environmental one or a social impact assessment. And I'll provide some examples of each of the outcomes of these steps in the subsequent slides. So we set out to, in this study, answer several research questions just to provide the scope or the system boundaries. We were looking at net zero economy-wide targets for 11 Western US states. And we wanted to understand how natural and agricultural land use protections or siting exclusions and different types of energy pathway assumptions impact total land use requirements, the optimal technology investment, so that's the amount of wind, solar, natural gas, other types of non-renewable technologies. How does that shift in response to these siting protections? We looked at total system costs because this is often an important criteria for decision makers. And then finally, what is the sort of comprehensive or system-wide scale impact of meeting this target for all 11 states? We looked at what we've been calling 3 siting levels. These siting levels correspond to different tiers of environmental exclusion. So level 1 only excludes areas that have some legal protection against any kind of development. These are national parks, military training areas. Level 2 are what we've called administratively protected. So these don't have sort of very strict protections against development, but they trigger some kind of administrative process whenever there is a proposal for development. So it requires consultation or review. So these are very highly sensitive areas, but there is no wholesale prohibition against development. Some of those examples include critical habitat for threatened endangered species, wetlands, and in this study, we included tribal lands. Level 3, so this is the highest level of protection against renewable energy development. And it includes the subsequent, the previous 2 levels, and adds entire suite of different land area types that Nature Conservancy scientists deem to be important for conservation, but don't have any legal protection. So an example of that include important bird areas. So diving into the results, this answers that question of how much land will we need under a net zero decarbonization scenario. So just to provide some orientation, that you can focus on the gray bars. The height of the length of those gray bars indicate the total land area. And then we've provided kind of a equivalent to put these numbers into some kind of perspective, equivalent land area within the state of New Mexico. So as you can see, the longest bar corresponds to the slow electrification energy pathway that assumes that we don't manage to electrify as quickly our transportation fleet, buildings, industry. And that path requires more renewable energy in general and more energy in general, and that we require half the area of New Mexico in that sort of most pessimistic case under siting level 1 with fewer protections. And this that range goes all the way to high electrification. This is where we electrify all those end uses rapidly before 2050. And that we find that this requires the least amount of land, even under the highest level of siting protection. So we have the amount that we would under the slow electrification siting level 1. And can we compare that with cases in which we don't look at net zero? So that's what these electricity only and reference scenarios. So that really underscores the need to look holistically at economy-wide. We then took those energy portfolios and we downscaled the generation and transmission. So these are maps of where those renewable energy projects could be located in order to meet these ambitious targets. So as you can see, there's a lot of infrastructure. This is solar on the left column, wind in the center, and then transmission. Most prominently, there's the long distance high voltage transmission on the right. And as you can see, those scenarios do differ depending on how many legal or siting level 3 restrictions we place. And so this finding underscores the need for really integrating those types of land use protections early in the process, because that significantly shapes the outcome of these build outs. We find that to answer that question of how does this impact the overall composition of these energy portfolios, so what is the balance of wind versus solar versus other technologies, you can see without getting into the weeds of these figures that the overall balance or the ratio of these colors don't differ very significantly across the 3 columns, which differ in terms of their siting levels. So going from left to right, we increase the number of protections, but that doesn't really change. We don't do a wholesale shift from wind all the way to solar. It does slightly alter that balance, but on the whole, the system is still dominated by wind and solar technologies, though there is increase in utility scale PV in response to more land use protections.
Grace, you're at time.
Oh, is it 14 minutes or 15?
It's 15, but
go okay.
Do a couple more slides, we'll switch. No, okay. It's okay.
I'll just wrap up the results. I won't go into the takeaways. Okay, so this is last 2 slides. The impacts to answer that third question about costs, we find that achieving these goals don't actually require a large cost premium. We find that under siting level 3, under the high electrification pathway, there's only a 3% cost increase in 2050 over a siting level 1 scenario. So it's 3% cost in order to achieve a much higher level of siting protections. And then finally, to answer that last question of what are the environmental and social impacts here, I'm focusing just on the environmental impacts. we find that these bars, we're showing ag lands, natural lands, these different types of protected lands, and specific species habitat. These impacts actually very much differ across the 3 siting levels, 1, 2, and 3. One thing that we find is that under this high conservation value land use type or category, we find that these impacts can be significantly higher if we don't protect them. So protections are actually effective in avoiding negative siting impacts. And the second important finding is that we notice that agricultural lands play an increasingly large role in higher land use protection scenarios. So the amount of wind is particularly that occurs on agricultural land increase, and at the same time they decrease in natural lands. Okay, I'm happy to wrap up here. So in the interest of time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Just a reminder to our audience that we are taking questions via the Q&A field at the bottom of your Zoom window. And without further ado, we'll turn it over to our next presenter, Emily Leslie.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, thank you. Great. That was a really great introduction. And some of my material may seem a little bit repetitive with Grace's material because we work closely together on many things. So apologize for some repetition, but my goal today is to sort of provide you a series of maps showing the application of methods that Grace and I have developed together in different regions and different forums. She provided a great motivation. So I think you all understand why this type of analysis is needed. As decarbonization efforts gain steam, there's an increasing need to visualize the energy modeling results in a way that enables audiences to see what does this mean and what will this infrastructure look like in my region. Like I said, I'm going to give an overview of a few different spatial analyses that we have performed in conjunction with some energy modeling studies to essentially translating the low resolution energy model results into higher resolution geographic maps to meet decarbonization goals. I'm not sure if these gray boxes interfering with your ability to see my screen. Can you see that gray box? Is up?
It popped up for half a second and then it went away.
Okay, thank you. So we start with these are some visuals from the REDI and RES studies. The REDI study was a renewable energy transmission initiative that was undertaken by California state agencies in 2010. That study was done in collaboration with RES, Western Renewable Energy Zone Study. These two studies were a collaboration of several entities, the Western Governors Association, a couple of California state agencies, and the National Renewable Energy Lab. This is sort of a simplified, on the left you see a simplified diagram of some of the methods that Grace described, sort of steps 1, 2, and 3 in her process of characterizing the renewable energy resource potential, overlaying GIS data layers. These are essentially map layers to exclude areas that are not suitable for renewable energy development. So we exclude protected areas, urban areas, water bodies, terrain features, et cetera. And we come out with a set of GIS data layers which characterize the technical potential for renewable energy. That technical potential data set can be visualized in the supply curve, which is the figure you see on the right. The y-axis is the cost of the renewable energy coming from each technology, and the x-axis, the width of the bars, is the amount of renewable energy that's available from each technology. The colors represent the different technologies, and essentially you can, in your energy planning exercise, you can sort of march your way up this supply curve until you've reached the target in terms of how much clean electricity you need for your particular decarbonization goal. The numbers in this figure are not current. They're for illustration only to give a little bit of an idea of where this analysis is going. Let's see. This map shows a geographic representation of the renewable energy resources that we saw on the prior slide. This is a map from the RES study, the Western Renewable Energy Zone study, and it essentially identified high quality renewable resource zones throughout the Western US, and then worked to identify transmission solutions to deliver these clean electricity resources from the supply location to the demand centers. Many of these zones, this study was performed in 2010 to 12 timeframe. Many of these zones have been developed pretty heavily. The zone that you see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but California West here, this is the Tehachapi area, which has probably 10,000 megawatts of new wind and solar installed today. And some of the other zones are still actively under development. There are still long distance transmission lines that have been permitted that are still in the process of finalizing contractual arrangements to deliver New Mexico wind to California and to deliver Wyoming wind to California as well. So many of these zones are still actively under development. Some of these zones haven't really materialized, and several studies since the time of this study have been looking into the reasons why and essentially looking to improve upon this analysis and make it more realistic. These are the maps from, so we're switching studies from the RES study now to the Nature Conservancy study. At the time of the RES study, large-scale renewable energy development was relatively new. And over the next several years, siting and permitting conflicts became more common. The Nature Conservancy had participated in the RES study as a stakeholder, and then the Nature Conservancy became interested in taking a deeper look at the environmental implications of large-scale renewable energy development. And Grace described the power of place analysis that took place as a result. These are some figures from that analysis. These are maps of siting level 1, siting level 2, and siting level 3. So in siting level 1, you see just the legally protected lands, and all the way up to siting level 3, we see lands of multiple types of protections and conservation importance. So with this Nature Conservancy Power of Place study that Grace already described, the research questions, I tend to describe them in a simpler way. Ideally, we were trying to understand, is there enough land to meet the need for clean electricity to meet California's climate goals and climate goals for the Western US? And is it possible to design a portfolio that satisfies the need and minimizes impacts to nature? So when we remove the green areas from the prior slide, what we come out with are the remaining areas. That's the wind and solar resource potential. So the orange polygons are the solar resource potential under the 3 siting level assumptions. The wind is the blue is the wind resource potential. Let's see if I'm missing anything. Each blue and orange polygon that you see here has location-specific characteristics indicating how much energy could be produced from that polygon. We call the polygons candidate project areas. And each candidate project area has attributes such as annual energy production cost and transmission cost to connect to the grid. We put this list of polygons into the capacity expansion model, and what you're seeing here is an example modeling result. If all of the green areas on the left were protected, then a 2050 net zero greenhouse gas, a 2050 net zero economy-wide infrastructure build out would look like what you're seeing on the right. The orange polygons are solar, the blue polygons are wind, the gray lines are existing transmission, and the colored lines are new transmission. You'll note that there are lines delivering New Mexico wind to California and Wyoming wind to California, as was initially identified as needed in the RES study back in the 2010-2012 timeframe. That was the power of place study. I'm switching gears now to give a quick overview of the California Public Utilities Commission Integrated Resource Plan proceeding. This is essentially a practical application of the methods that were developed in the studies described earlier. So the California Public Utilities Commission Integrated Resource Plan is a forum in which modeling results are put to use. And the modeling results directly inform the transmission upgrades that will be selected by the Cal ISO and presented to the Board of Governors for approval. This is a flow diagram of the annual planning cycle. These are the steps, the modeling steps that we go through every year to refresh and update the model, present results to the Cal ISO. For the box in the lower right is the transmission planning process. That's the Cal ISO grid operators process through which they analyze and approve transmission upgrades. The basis for this proceeding at the CPUC is a requirement from SB 350. When this bill passed, it required 50% renewable energy, and it updated the California Public Utilities Code to require the CPUC to implement a planning process to ensure that the load serving entities, the electricity providers in California, would could realistically meet the GHG and electricity targets established by the statute. Here is an example modeling result from the CPUC Integrated Resource Plan work. On the left, we have the transmission constraints on the grid in California. The polygons are the areas affected by each constraint, and the points are the substations included in that constraint. In the middle, we have a diagram of the new renewable energy capacity that would be needed in order to satisfy the planning target. Yellow bubbles are solar, purple bubbles are energy storage, mostly batteries. Blue bubbles are wind. We have offshore wind and turquoise bubbles, and each bubble occurs at a substation. And the spatial allocation of these resources is somewhat informed by the methods we've described in the prior studies, and also somewhat informed by the level of commercial interest at each substation, indicated by developer applications in the interconnection queue. The total portfolio is summarized in the bar chart on the right. You can see there's quite a bit of new renewable energy capacity needed to meet the 2032 clean electricity targets. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'm going to fly through a few more slides.
You have about 3 minutes.
Okay. These are really just provided to give you some visuals and get you thinking. These are example spatial analysis results from the Princeton Net Zero America and repeat studies. I believe Jamil is going to talk further about this. This study took a slightly different approach to the transmission analysis in particular. So in Power of Place, we modeled the high voltage transmission through essentially one transmission connection for each state-to-state connection. And here in the Princeton study, they've actually looked at transmission that would be required to connect the major cities, quite a few more nodes in the network, and quite a few more lines resulting. Let's see. This is a quick slide from the San Diego Regional Decarbonization Framework. I included this to show that this type of spatial analysis can occur both at the national scale, like for the Princeton study, and also at the very local scale. This is a study looking specifically at the county of San Diego. The polygons on the map are the selected candidate project areas to meet a decarbonization target within the County of San Diego using resources from within the County of San Diego. So the orange polygons are solar, the blue polygons are wind. This is the least cost path scenario. And we also have a high conservation scenario, which includes a lot more solar on rooftops and in infill areas. So ground mounted solar within more densely populated areas and fewer large utility scale solar projects in remote locations. We've also done this kind of analysis for Europe, and you can see on the left scenario using essentially base land use constraints, and on the right, we have a much more restrictive set of land use constraint assumptions, resulting in a smaller amount of total wind resource potential. And here are the assumptions that went into the base scenario versus the restrictive scenario. We tightened up the different site suitability criteria in order to produce the map on the right. The red cells in this table are the criteria that were changed to make a constrained scenario. And that's all I have. I just wanted to give you several examples of ways that the methods have been applied in different regions at different scales. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. You had about 20 seconds left. I think that's as close as you could possibly get it to being exact.
Right.
For that, I thank you. My job is easy. We'll turn it over to our third speaker, Jamil Farms, and then again, we'll have questions after. So feel free to send your questions in the Q&A field at the bottom of Zoom. Jamil, the floor is yours.
Thanks. And just to flag for folks, I am not actually a doctor. I just have my master's. I'm going to be talking actually about work that's a little bit more dated than what Emily referenced. This is a regional study that we did in collaboration with SDSN and the Decarbonization Pathways Project that was specifically looking at the Midwest. And before I start talking about the study, I'm going to go a little bit off script just to try to get some context about the work that I'm going to present here, which is more broadly energy systems modeling and how that fits with the work that Grace and Emily do. Right, so a lot of the work that people who do similar work to me were doing in the last 5 years or 10 years was just trying to answer the question of, right, can we decarbonize by 2050, right? How far can we go? What is technically possible? Is there even enough technical potential for solar and wind and these other pieces we need to fit together? With a lot more clarity on those questions, which is a definite yes, and it's probably going to cost a lot less than we had been assuming. That's opened up space to start answering some of the other questions that are really going to matter for implementation. So Emily and Grace have been talking about a really critical question, which is where could we put all these really cheap renewables, right? Can we even cite as many as the energy system models say we're going to do? But I'm hoping to draw out some of the other questions that are going to be really critical on the implementation pathway to help motivate why we do these energy system studies. And some of the questions that they sort of raise that we need to figure out to actually do a good job. So this is the only map that I'm going to show you, and that's a lot less pretty because, as Grace mentioned, the type of modeling we do is going to be much more coarse geographically. So this study in particular was done on a state level. So we were looking at these 9 states that we're calling the Midwest for this study. And this analysis was completed in 2020. So for those of you who've been following the US federal climate policy context, this is before the more recent legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has really significant incentives for renewables and a few other things. But with this study, we're really trying to answer the question of, given that the Midwest is a significant fraction of emissions today, roughly 20% in 2019 emissions. And given that no one has really looked at in detail, what does it mean for the Midwest to decarbonize? If we look at 2050 to hit a net zero CO2 goal for the energy system, what's the role and what are the opportunities that uniquely show up for the Midwest? Right, so what are some of the unique challenges there? Where are the unique opportunities, and what do these states together need to be thinking about as we start to ramp up for meaningful decarbonization? So again, this work was supported by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and that was part of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. So let me just start with, before we get into any of the details, some of the motivations for why we think subnational or regional studies can be really useful. So often you'll hear, again, these decarbonization studies on a national scale to try to understand, right, is this even technically feasible? How much would it cost to the country as a whole? When we move to a regional level, there's some really critical insights that are going to matter for implementation and actually doing these changes that we don't always see when we do a national level study. So in the US context in particular, when we're looking at a regional study, one of the things that's really going to matter is we have more granular renewable resource potential. So we don't, again, have the same level of detail that Emily and Grace were talking about, but it's much finer scale than what we would see with a national study. Another critical piece here is that we're actually talking about common markets for some of the key decarbonization technologies. So a big example I'll talk about in more detail for the Midwest is electrification of building heating, right? So the air source heat pumps that are going to be sold in the Midwest are going to look different than the ones that are sold in the Southeast of the US because they have such higher heating demand. And then a final key consideration is the way planning is done in the US. So a lot of the large scale energy infrastructure that's going to need to be deployed to do this actually lines up pretty closely with the regional level analysis. So for electric transmission expansion, many of those states are actually part of the same grid operation organization, and a lot of the electric infrastructure planning takes place within that, right? So it's going to be a question of multiple states working together and multiple shareholders within inside those states to try to answer some of these questions about, if new electric transmission gets built, where should it go, right? And so in our mind, this regional study can help set up, right, what are some of these key planning and policy making questions, and who are the stakeholders that we really need to convene in order to make this transition an equitable one. So I'll talk in more detail about some of the findings to sort of set up some of these key questions and how that relates back to this question of planners, policymakers, and stakeholders. All right, so coming back to the study, so we were really focused on just two key questions for the study, and that's how do energy supply, demand, investment, and infrastructure within the Midwest need to evolve to enable this net zero low carbon transition by 2050. And the second is, what are the key decarbonization opportunities and challenges in the region, and how do they interact both within and outside the region? So again, I'll have a handful of specific topics where we sort of go into this in a little more detail later on in my presentation. Just a really quick aside on the modeling tools, not a lot of detail here, but again, Grace mentioned capacity expansion. So that's one of the tools that we use to do this analysis. The other piece, well, so capacity expansion, which we use this model called RIO, which we developed in-house. That's really answering the question of what are the investments we want to make on the supply side to get a least cost energy system that still meets whatever our policy goals are. So for this analysis, it was net zero by 2050. That works in tandem with a demand side focused model. It's called the Energy Pathways. And that really helps us build up an understanding of, if this is what stocks of different technologies look like, and this is the level of service demand. So that could be how many kilometer miles per vehicle, it could be how much heating for a particular geography, those sorts of pieces. How do all of those fit together, and how do those change demand for energy, including hourly electricity load shape? And then we use that demand side scenario-based tool to populate the data for our capacity expansion model. And then we figure out what are those least cost investments that can decarbonize and meet all the energy requirements. All right, so before we get to Midwest results, just a really quick context piece about US deep decarbonization. So since this is a regional study, I'm not really going to talk about national results beyond this, but over the last really 7 or 8 years, Evolved has been working on the space about, in the US nationally, what does it take to meet our emissions reduction goals by 2050? And for a net zero energy system, there's really 4 key pieces that we've identified over the course of many different studies. And those are that we need to decarbonize electricity, right? So recent studies suggest we're on the order of a 90%, 95% decrease in emissions in the emissions intensity of the electricity system. That works together with serious improvements in energy efficiency. So again, a 40% drop in energy use per capita, really driven by deployment of different types of technologies and end uses. A lot of this is driven by electrification. So that electrification in particular is the third pillar here, where we're shifting away from direct fossil combustion technologies towards electrified technologies that are significantly more efficient, right, which helps with our energy efficiency question, but also just have the advantage of, if they're using clean electricity, right, it enables us to remove a lot of emissions out of the system. And then the final piece, which has become clearer, is if folks have focused more and more on a net zero target by 2050, is the question of carbon capture. So this carbon capture could be for either utilization of that CO2 to produce synthetic fuels or industrial products, or it could be for geological sequestration or storage. But again, these numbers are based on another study from 2020, but we're estimating on the order of 3/4 of a gigaton of captured carbon by 2050. Right, so these 4 pillars are going to show up in what we are estimating the Midwest needs to do. And I'm just going to give you a snapshot of, for those states that I flagged earlier, right? What does the transition look like between 2020 and 2050? So again, it follows that same broad story as the US, where reference case is going to be no climate action, so just least cost investments through 2050. And DDP is the deep decarbonization pathway, so that's our net zero case. So you can see for our DDP case, we're making serious investments in renewables because those are what our capacity expansion is finding is the cheapest way to clean up electricity. So a major expansion of renewable energy to clean up electricity, both transportation and buildings are shifting significantly towards electricity in this major electrification effort. And that's decreasing use of these other fossil fuels. And of the remaining fuels, particularly liquid fuels, we're figuring out ways to clean up those fuels with either drop-in biofuels or synthetic fuels. The biofuels question is particularly salient for the Midwest. All right, so now to talk broadly about some of the results. We don't need to go through every detail on the slide, but I think it may be useful for folks to have. If you look at the report, we actually examine all of these different bolded bits in detail. I'm only going to walk through the first 4 for this presentation in the interest of time. But given what the Midwest does currently in terms of energy production, and given its manufacturing base and some of the other questions, all of these pieces are going to be really salient questions that are challenging, not necessarily solely from a technical standpoint, but from a planning and policymaking standpoint. So I'm actually going to walk through these first 4 to try to illustrate that in a little bit more detail. Right, so a key opportunity for the Midwest is going to be the shift away from ethanol towards advanced biofuels nationally. So as I showed on that previous slide, right, we're electrifying transportation, demand for liquid fuels is really decreasing, but where demand remains, we need to clean up those fuels. And the charts here is showing for the US as a whole, right, what does the change in liquid fuel and natural gas supply look like? And you can see that about 1/3 of, well, maybe it's more like 1/4 in 2050 of liquid fuels and natural gas are coming from advanced biofuels. So these are going to be things like second generation Fischer-Tropsch based biofuels. And the Midwest in particular has this role in shifting from its current role as a major corn ethanol producer to a producer of these new advanced biofuels in the future. Right, and so this finding really helps us understand some key enabling questions about how do we get to 2050, right? And these are the important pieces that show up for planners, for different stakeholders within the region, and particularly questions around what does an equitable transition look like? So some of the key enabling questions for this opportunity are really what quantity of biomass will be available for biofuel production, right? That's something we can't answer well given the geographic granularity of our model, but an analysis like Grace or Emily we're speaking to could help us get better answers here. The question of how the transition away from ethanol and towards advanced biofuels unfold in the Midwest, right? There's some pretty significant political interests that made the ethanol industry look the way that it does today in the Midwest, right? And how do we change that? How does that move towards producing more advanced biofuels? And finally, which policies can help realize additional benefits of new biofuel production, right? Are there other things are there policy structures that can work well to help sort of break out of the current structure to start to transition us towards what we need to get to our 2050 targets? So another opportunity, leading the transition to electric vehicles. So our analysis is showing that the electrification of light duty vehicles can lower final energy demand for transportation by 70%, which is a huge advantage, right, if we're focused on reducing emissions. And the graph here is comparing total sales of light duty vehicles between 2020 and 2050 for the reference case versus our DDP case. And you can see that huge increase in the green bar there of light duty vehicles. All right, so that's our electrification effort results in a 6-fold increase in EV sales through 2050, right? And a lot of these vehicle manufacturers are currently based in the Midwest. And this is a huge opportunity for those manufacturers, as well as their supply chains that are also located throughout the region, right? But again, this comes with some pretty important enabling questions that really the region as a whole needs to grapple with in order to position itself to actually see this growth in domestic market. So how can these regional industries get ahead, be strategically positioned for this change? How quickly will demand for electric vehicles materialize? I will say that question has changed dramatically in the last 2 years, particularly with the incentives passed by the Inflation Reduction Act. And then the final enabling question is, what role is there for policy in enabling this transformation? Third of 4 opportunities I'm going to speak about here. So exporting wind energy to the rest of the nation. So you guys may recall from the overview slide of the Midwest, right? Electricity production, particularly from renewable, skyrockets in the Midwest. And that's really about the fact that the region has such a good wind resource that it's able to become an exporter for really for other regions in the US, particularly the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. So our analysis shows the Midwest generating about 30% of all onshore wind in the US, which is roughly 500 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity by 2050. Right, so again, these enabling questions, that's a lot of wind. How is the region actually going to permit and build at this scale, which is about 15 gigawatts per year over the next 30 years? Relatedly, right, how are we going to actually be able to connect all of that wind to the load centers as is necessary? So are we going to develop new intra and inter-regional transmission? Really, a key question for folks who focus on electricity is this question of how will we actually allocate the cost for transmission? And then another important piece here is just how will evolving technology, cost, and performance actually influence all of this? And then final opportunity is this question of electrification of building heat, right? So the Midwest has much higher average household heating needs than the rest of the United States as a whole. right? And so as we make this push towards electrification, you can see that there's higher electricity demand in 2050 for the Midwest, right? It's a real opportunity to save energy within the region, but there's also some important key enabling questions to do that. So a really important one is, given how bill payments are structured and how public support for utility bills is structured in the United States, how do we manage potential equity and distributional implications of electric heating, right? This is a significant change from depending on primarily natural gas heating in the region. And related to that, historically, we focused on gas utilities as being one of the main vehicles for doing efficiency programs around heating, right? So what is the role of those gas utilities if we're moving toward an electrified future in their efficiency programs? And then the complementary question to that is, how can other efficiency programs evolve quickly to support electrification? Right? We're talking about deployment at a much larger scale than these programs have really been built to do in the past. And another key question around electricity with this new electrified load for heating is, how will new electric peaks be managed? I'm talking about a shift from a lot of these states being summer peaking driven by air conditioning loads to being winter peaking driven by cold mornings during cold snaps.
If you could, please.
Yep, this should be the last one. So just quick implications for the regional study, which really mirrors what we've seen from other regional studies. And that's if we want those desirable outcomes of a net zero 2050 future, there's two key pieces that we see need to happen on a regional level. So the first is the long-term planning and cross-coordination between sectors and geographies is really critical, which can help build a shared vision of the system we want in 2050, right? And so that long-term planning and cross-coordination is happening on a regular basis, not just a one-off. And the second piece is really maintaining a focus on these long-term goals is going to be critical for the near-term policy we develop to decarbonize. All right, that's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a lot of really exciting questions, and I hope we can get to as many of them as possible. Shannon is going to introduce our first questioner.
Yes, we've had lively presentations, and I know we have a number of questions coming our way. I want to first introduce a student who will be asking a live question today. Christina Gretz. Is Christina on the line or in our Zoom room? Can someone confirm that Christina is here?
I think Isabella should be trying to bring her. Oh, yes, she's in.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful.
Perfect.
Welcome, Christina. Christina is studying law with a specific interest in tax law at the Federal Public University of Paraná. She's from Curitiba in the state of Paraná, Brazil. Christina is involved in student groups dedicated to arbitration, commercial law, and tax law, as well as participating in model court competitions. She especially appreciates the multidisciplinary aspects of these areas of study, as she's learned much about disputes related to environmental licensing, construction of renewable energy generation plants, and their impact on the environment. She joined the Global Columbia Collaboratory in order to learn from others' perspectives and understand the impact of climate change on other populations. She's looking forward to contributing to the Collaboratory through her teamwork, skills, readiness to perform tasks, and technical law expertise. Welcome to the Collaboratory, Christina. Please ask your question.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having me. So my question is more directed to Emily Leslie, but of course, all the panelists can contribute to the answer. And well, considering the role that natural landscape, natural resources, and social characteristics play in identifying low impact and high quality areas for wind and solar development, is it possible to assume there are some areas doomed to rely on non-renewable energy? And if so, can how could said areas or countries work towards reducing GHG emissions without depending on other countries and regions, given the current scenario of energy crisis in Europe? Thank you.
It's a great question. There are many overlapping layers there. So thank you for the question. Are some areas doomed to rely on non-renewable energy? Certainly decarbonization is more difficult in some locations than others. And that, the goal of our work is to identify pathways to decarbonization. So I would like to say that it's not important. There's no location where it's impossible. Of course, it's possible. We just need to figure out how. And in some places, it's harder than others. So you touch on the role of imports and exports, and that's generally in the different scenarios that we model, we vary the level of imports, of assumed imports and exports, in order to try to see if we can get the model to solve without imports, for example. We have not done such a study in Ukraine specifically, so it's hard to say what the result would be. But that's, I think you mentioned the role of, did you specifically mention the role of nuclear? Certainly in California, there's a toggle in the model to assume California continues to rely on nuclear power, or to assume that the Diablo Canyon plant is shut down, and the different solution emerges depending on whether you assume one way or the other way. Do others want to chime in? Grace, I saw you turned your camera
I'm happy to. I agree with all of Emily's comments, and I think I would just add, as a plug for the need to do planning on a regular cycle, is that we recognize that our models only capture a small part of the world, and that there's a lot of future uncertainties that we're not going to capture, and often need to come back and integrate into the model. Right, so I think the long-term planning process can help us answer the questions of, right, if this is the least cost way to do it, what do we want to do for policy? But major shocks to the world energy market, we're not going to be able to capture, and that really motivates, right? We need to come back to the table and look at our answers again and try to come up with robust solutions to be basing policy and other societal plans on.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christina, for your question. I'm going to turn to some of the other questions that are coming in through the chat, and some that were pre-submitted to us before the event. A lot of them have common themes. There are a lot of them kind of touching on this issue of trade and imports and exports and kind of the larger global system within which we're operating and trying to understand these models. There were a couple of questions which touched on the idea that if you're passing some of this more ambitious legislation in wealthier countries, that you might be outsourcing some of our dirtier, higher emitting, harder to abate kinds of activities to other countries where they don't have as restrictive of a law, and then all of that is coming in imports. And there was a larger sort of more optimist. So my first question, I guess, or the first thread in this is, what can or can't you model? How much can or can't you understand? And do you have any recommendations for policymakers as to how to try to sort of prevent these spillover effects from happening? And there was a follow-up sort of related question as well about what the responsibility might be from these kinds of countries as well to financially support the energy transition in lower income or emerging economies, and trying to scale up renewable investment there as well as at home. Sorry, that was a very long-winded question, but feel free, anybody can jump in on any point or not point that you want to take up. Maybe I'll suggest Jamil first, then Emily, then Grace, or none of you. Just shake your head if you're not planning on jumping in.
I can try to give a partial answer to some of that. So I think a lot of the countries and jurisdictions that Evolved has done research in, this question of at least like the direct energy imports, I think has been very present, and a recognition of accounting for the emissions across the supply chain. I do think it's been a lot easier in those jurisdictions because those are generally either close to self-sufficient in terms of energy production or they're actual exporters. So for example, we're wrapping up a study we did for Net Zero Australia, right? And a lot of the questions there were actually about, can they decarbonize their energy exports? So I'm less positioned to speak to places where energy imports are a really key question, right? And thinking about the emissions associated with that. I will say one of the areas that I know we recognize that there's room for improvement is just the questions of what happens with supply chains, right? So there's a lot of press that's been out right now about materials for EV production, right? And what do those supply chains look like? And I mean, it's an area that needs work. I don't think that we as modelers have clear answers for that, but a recognition that this is a really important piece to an equitable transition. And it's not clear if we have all the international sort of authority in place to do a good job at this, but I think lots of people are thinking about it and trying to do better.
If Emily has anything to add, or you can just shake your head. Same for
That's a
me.
great response. I don't have anything to add to that.
One thing that I can add is that some of the work that I've been doing internationally, I shared a paper on a study that we just published in the Southern African region. So I think in the Southern African power pool, it lends itself really well to doing regional analysis because they're in the midst of participating in a more fully fledged energy market. And they're behaving much more as a coordinated region than as individual countries. And in that case, to do regional energy planning analysis makes a lot more sense because some of these countries are inherently better endowed with renewable energy resources than others, and some are more inherently endowed with better conventional energy resources. So this idea of optimizing energy trade to maximize renewable energy usage with inter-country transmission planning, I think is, the ideal way to go with energy planning for certain contexts, kind of the macro scale version of what we do in the US at the state level. I think it lends itself well to being done internationally. In terms of the sort of historical responsibility for financing other emerging countries' decarbonization pathways, I think this is hugely important for developing countries because cost is such a huge barrier. Its capacity, access to finance. South Africa received almost, I think, 9 billion in climate related funding. Our analysis showed that in order to achieve early coal retirements in that region, most of which is in South Africa, would require more than 10 billion. So it really helps close that gap and make it a lot more likely that these countries will preemptively choose to retire fossil fuel power plants in a way that would not have happened purely on a cost efficiency basis.
Thank you so much. I think the international financing is a challenge as well, because you're talking about countries that don't have a lot of upfront capital to invest, and they're borrowing on the international market at very high interest rates because they're perceived as being high risk. So I think there's also, part of this answer as well, I think, is revising our institutional architecture for organizations like the IMF and the World Bank to try to come up with some more affordable mechanisms to access the upfront capital you need. Turning back to something else you said too, though, Grace, about this need to sort of balance demand for electricity with places where you have a lot of supply or a lot of potential. There was another thread that was coming through a number of the questions about the role of cities in either generating their own power or linkages between urban areas and this rural divide, where you have these really high power demands and you're sort of dependent on this much larger region for siting these things and generating powers to power cities. I think this is especially challenging in the US, where we have a lot of other things that sort of are baked in with this rural urban divide, issues around politics and things like that. Maybe you could start to see to elaborate how any of that impacts your work, or if you've done any look at in this regional perspective. You had explicitly talked about some of these like arguments and territorial fighting that's coming around banning siting decisions. And then maybe we'll go to Jamil as well, because my other part of this question would be, are there differences in how this is thought about in a region like California versus the Midwest? Sorry, Grace, I was hoping you might start with California, rural urban divide, and then we'll go to Jamil.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in on this. I think what we've been able to find in other related research is that most certainly the trend of citing utility scale renewables place a disproportionate burden on rural communities. So the average population density of current power plants are lower on average. And we also find that where we think that low impact suitable sites for solar in particular in California will occur in disadvantaged communities. So there needs to be some kind of mechanisms in place, policies, incentives to ensure that development is procedurally just and equitable, and that there's compensation in a form that the communities feel are, on par with the negative impacts of that industrial infrastructure. So the state of California has started really engaging at that level. And I think what really needs to happen, because siting is so local, there needs to be better coordination of where we anticipate these projects occurring, and some kind of coordination at the county level or municipal level as to where they want to see this infrastructure, and coordination with government as to what types of tax benefits and community benefits they can get from inviting these types of projects into their communities. Does that help answer the question? I'm not sure if I fully captured it.
I think to follow on Grace's question and the sort of regional perspective of differences we've seen, I think the world of planning in the US has changed dramatically with the passage of this federal legislation. I think in the past, you may have seen, right, California was on the forefront of grappling with a lot of these questions, really driven by state policy and state priorities. But we're now in a world where the incentives for renewables in particular are going to be long enough and attractive enough that basically every utility plan for what they thought they were going to procure, they need to redo. I think a lot of the regions that didn't have these policy goals are now going to be grappling with, right, this is a straight economic question of, now we need to figure out siting more wind and solar because it's cheaper than what we had thought we were going to need to do. And as Grace said, all siting is local. So I think there's a lot of places that hopefully can learn from other experiences quickly. But I think some of the challenges we've seen in places that had more ambitious policy than the rest of the country are going to start to spread to a lot of other jurisdictions that had not been thinking about this as much.
Thank you. Taking another question from the chat, maybe this time we'll start with Emily, and anybody else who wants to chime in can. You talked about these very elaborate modeling scenarios that are dependent on a lot of different kinds of data that's being inputted. Where do you make assumptions versus where are you working on sort of concrete historical or real-time data? And what's some of the data gaps that you grapple with, or the data that you don't have that you really wish you did that would help reduce uncertainty?
Oh, that's a good question. So where do we make assumptions and where do we gather data? There are so many data sources and so many assumptions. Some of the key assumptions that I can speak to that we have been adjusting or testing in the California modeling context lately, we have been the really key variables where we don't have enough data and we simply have to make an assumption are on topics like offshore wind should we be anticipating a high offshore wind future or a low offshore wind future? And we don't have enough data to support an assumption on that, because there really hasn't been very much offshore wind deployed in the US at all, maybe 30 megawatts in Rhode Island. I think there's a new project in Virginia, but no offshore wind on the West Coast has been deployed yet. So we don't have enough data and we have to make an assumption there. Similarly, we don't have a lot of experience contracting for large, remote, out-of-state wind power. So we really have to either assume that California will be receiving imports of New Mexico wind and Wyoming wind, or assume those projects may never materialize. That's an assumption. There's not really enough data to give us an answer on that. And the nuclear, do you know, should we assume that the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant retires or continues to remain online? That's another one. It's really an assumption and not super well data supported. The second part of your question, where are the data gaps? I think we've addressed that. Did you want to?
Yeah, it was just like, is there any data that you really wish you had? The reading
there is a data set that
I'm getting as well, though, is that like a lot of your uncertainty is around human behavior and our ethics and our values, and you know how that causes you to make assumptions about unpredictable future scenarios.
Certainly. Yeah, there is a data set that I really want that Grace and I have discussed many times, which is a spatially explicit map layer representing wind power, local county level ordinances prohibiting or placing a moratorium on wind power development. The National Renewable Energy Lab recently released an Excel spreadsheet with a list of counties with moratoriums and prohibitions. But that data set is relatively new and does not exist yet for solar, or might just be newly available for solar as well. And it is extremely labor intensive to gather data on the county ordinances for every county in the country. There are 3,000 counties, and these ordinances are changing all the time. So for that to be well developed and continuously updated would be amazing.
Maybe some of the people on the line would be interested in getting in touch with you to do some kind of a collaborative project where we have different universities in different states, you know, just maintaining a database of just their counties with the same methodology. I think a final question, and then we'll turn to any concluding remarks. There were a lot of questions as well that came up about the role of biofuels in the future, or what we may or may not know or predict or assume about that, given that this is one of the more polarizing areas with some of the topics that have already been raised about, you know, citing food versus fuel, biofuels, food versus fuel. Jamil, you explicitly talked about biofuels in your presentation. Maybe we'll start with you on any thoughts you have about what the future is for biofuel and ways that you can minimize negative impacts. And if any of the other panelists want to chime in, that would be great as well.
Sure, I'm happy to start, and I think particularly Grace's input about land use and the recent analysis that she talked about in her presentation will be really helpful. So yeah, we generally have focused most on biofuels in the US context, so that's what I'll give as my starting point for an answer. So a lot of what we see in the US is really just this question of advanced biofuels versus how we understand them today. So much of the biofuels discussion today is dominated by corn ethanol in transesterification processes for biodiesel. We really see the role of biofuels in the future is, right, one way to fill that gap of, to the extent liquid fuels remain, so things like aviation, some potential other shipping applications that are where electrification is likely just not going to be feasible. So biofuels are really competing against synthetic fuels. And for us, it's the question of, right, if both synthetic fuels, so these would be electric-based fuels, where you're taking green hydrogen together with captured CO2 to produce a fuel. for us, it sort of reduces to a question of cost, right? Assuming that both of these things can develop and deploy at scale. So we're really looking at advanced biofuels that are primarily going to be derived from woody biomass feedstocks. So a lot of these could come from potentially marginal lands or could help with fire reductions in some locations. But there's fire mitigation in a lot of locations, but there's a lot of questions just about future costs, transportation costs, right, development of these industries. But I will say that we think technologically as well as politically, the future really is trying to move away from this question of is the bio feedstocks, are those competing with land that potentially may be used for food? But Grace has a lot more to say about the land use questions than I do.
Please, Grace.
Most of the work that we've done is restricted to the Western US, at least until the national study is done and released. But what I can add is that in the Western US study, we assumed multiple types of restrictions on the amount of biomass feedstocks that come from the rest of the US primarily. And in our most restrictive scenario, we assume that there's no net land use change due to biomass production. And one, that scenario solved, meaning that biomass can be constrained and we can successfully achieve our net zero pathway goals. Two, it does increase the costs. So something has to give. So if we don't have biofuels to pick up that slack that Jamil was talking about with the hard to electrified end uses, then we're going to have to produce those fuels from high cost electricity. So the upside is it's possible. And like in a intermediate scenario is that we use corn ethanol lands for production of next generation feedstocks like switchgrass and miscanthus. So that's another possibility. And all of those are those are all feasible. It's really a matter of how much more are we willing to pay in order to minimize the direct land use impacts of biomass feedstocks. And this does include in the supply curve residues and wastes. So given that some of those are cost competitive, those are used by the model, and there are these purpose grown types feedstocks, both woody and herbaceous, that we've restricted to either existing corn ethanol lands or on areas that we've deemed lower impact.
Emily, any final thoughts from you on this question? Or no? Okay. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate so much Grace, Emily, and Jamil for being with us. This was an exciting session, great presentations, a wonderful conversation. I'm greatly thankful to you for being with us, and I'll turn it over to Shannon for a final thought as well.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. We've had an engaging discussion on energy use and land use planning. Our conversation touched on many critical issues related to land use policies and how they impact every aspect of the transition to zero greenhouse emissions, including the siting of renewable energy and how the complexity of policy choices in this area will require new efforts and enhanced cooperation. This was the first seminar in a series of seminars focused on pathways to decarbonization, delivered as a part of the Global Columbia Collaboratory, our virtual exchange platform that brings Columbia students, thought leaders, and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact. We're looking forward to the rest of this special series of collaboratory seminars, which will be offered this fall. So please keep an eye out for the seminar announcements. Thanks again to our esteemed panelists who joined us today and to our amazing moderator. Many thanks to the team at Columbia Global Centers Rio, Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, as well as the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, we want to extend a very special thank you to all of our collaboratory students, partners, and participants from around the world. A reminder that a link to a recording of the full webinar will be sent to everyone who registered. And for others, you'll be able to find it on our website. Thank you and be well.